welcome to another edition of the Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and in this series, we continue our examination of public policy, particularly the interface between foreign policy and domestic policy. And today's topic will be Guyana's diverse global diaspora, and of course, the nostalgia which I am aware that many members of the diaspora feel for their home country. Many Guyanese celebrities are, of course, in the diaspora. They're quite well known. We know of Dame Valerie Amos, Sir Sridat Ramphal, Sir Clive Lloyd, and I'm sure there are many other distinguished Guyanese in the diaspora. And not everyone could become a dame or a knight, but there are many hundreds of thousands of Guyanese who have departed these shores for various reasons. But wherever they go, they are not stateless. And there's an obligation on the part of our government, on the part of our constitution, to look after Guyanese wherever they find themselves. They deserve to be recognized not only for their achievements, but for the very fact that they were born on this bit of real estate we know as our Guyanese homeland. They need protection in times of destitution when they're away from their homeland. And Guyana has always been poor, and migration is something we should get accustomed to. It's not a sudden phenomenon. It didn't happen last year or last 10 or 20 years. You go back in history, you'll find the Guyanese have been migrating continuously, for several decades over the last century. And we need to realize that Guyana has always been a poor country, and people are entitled to look for a better life. And if they find that better life overseas, so be it, let them go there. And similarly, a lot of people have found a better life in Guyana, and they've come here from other countries. There are parts of our country, like in Mali, you see descendants of St. Lucians who came here in search of El Dorado. And of course, many Guyanese are descended from Barbadians who came here during the second half of the 19th century when the local Guyanese population was declining because of cholera and other waterborne diseases. So we must understand that migration is normal. And nowadays, every country in the world, I think, can boast of some huge diaspora. I remember speaking to the Mexican ambassador. He told me the Mexican diaspora in America is 30 million. So I can imagine that there's a huge government department which has to manage diaspora affairs. Migration has been steady, but I would say that up to the 1940s, it was a trickle. And young people, and you know them very well, might have gone to the United Kingdom, to participate in the war. In fact, Chancellor Victor Crane is a veteran of he was a veteran of the Second World War Air Force. He was an Air Force veteran. Dusty Miller, who became Chief Justice of Kenya, actually went away during the war years. And he was also in the Air Force. And after he qualified, he migrated, he went to Kenya and became Chief Justice. So many others who are not well known migrated during the 1940s, some to the war, and others as part of the Windrush generation. And we've been reading quite a lot about the Windrush generation, particularly in the United Kingdom, because these warfaring countries, and as you can see, they're still fighting. The warfaring countries are still warfaring. And after the war, the so-called victors, needed manpower. They needed nurses, they needed workers for their transportation services. And many West Indians, even though they had not gone up to United Kingdom during the war, were able to go after the war to fill the vacancies created by the thousands of soldiers who had been killed during the war. But in addition to that, Guyanese have always sought higher education. We never got our own university until the mid 1960s. And some people found it difficult even to get a secondary education in Guyana. Uh, Migration provided them the opportunity for self improvement, for the good life, if you want to put it like that. And it has continued ever since. So it has always been a trickle. But admittedly, during the 1960s, right through to the 1990s, uh, economic and social and political instability was a were a push factor, pushing ambitious young people, students, business families to go overseas. Um, well, not only for economic opportunity, but sometimes for safety, because they went to Canada, United Kingdom, United States, particularly, and the Caribbean. And those countries were looking for blue collar workers. You remember, there was a fierce recruitment for farm workers, and people were deliberately recruiting nurses, recruiting sugarcane workers, and Guyana was also involved in supplying migrants. Some people went overseas, they married overseas, stayed overseas, and raised families. So migration has always been a two-way street, and during the mid to late 1960s, particularly uh, many business people went to Canada, and for a while, Toronto became a hub for one of the largest Guyanese migrant populations. It's now been overtaken, of course, by New York City. But many people in the Caribbean, not only from Guyana, found it uh, prudent and expedient to migrate to Canada. So there's a huge diaspora in Toronto and also in among the cities in eastern United States, so from New York, New Jersey, all the way down to Florida. And of course, there's some deeper inland. But by the turn of this century, the present century, Toronto has been overtaken by New York. And in fact, the Guyanese diaspora constitutes the fifth largest immigrant population in New York. That means it's competing with the Puerto Ricans and Jamaicans. So you can see it is a very large number. Right now, it is calculated that the per capita migration rate is extremely high. There are about 30,000 Guyanese leaving our homeland every year. It's one of the highest in the world. And whether we can turn the tide, I don't know. But it has continued, regardless of the government that's in office. So it is not necessarily a political matter, it's a human choice. And I don't think there's been any impediment there's been no wall, there's been no means of preventing Guyanese from migrating, as has happened in some other countries. And we have erected no walls to prevent people from entering. So I reckon that at present there are between 80 to 100,000 uh, Venezuelans. And you can see recently from the newspaper, a few more thousands have come. Some of them scrounging and scavenging in garbage dumps. Uh, Brazilians have come in to work in the gold diamond fields, and Haitians, Cubans have come to do shopping. So it's a two-way street. But we need to prepare for this flood, especially in light of last week's news that huge boatloads of destitute Venezuelans have been coming into the country, and they want food, and that food is not to be found in garbage dumps. There's a more humane response, and we have been responding to particularly the Venezuelan migration problem over the last 5 years. One of the first things I did when I got into office in 2015 was to establish a department of citizenship, because I realized at that time, and it's become obvious in other countries, that migration was a major issue. And it is not a sideshow, it is not something to be stuck under the department, under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Ministry of Home Affairs. You required a dedicated minister to pay attention to the reception and the documentation and the settlement of the of migrants who keep coming into the country. Right now, we have noticed a trend in the diaspora. We've noticed the trend uh, of Guyanese living close to the borders. For example, those who live close to the Suriname border, particularly in Region 6, have been going to Naikeri. Those who live close to the Venezuelan border in Region 1, Region 2 have been going to Puerto Ordaz. And those who live in the south, close to the Brazilian border, have been turning up in Boa Vista. And as a result of this, we took a deliberate decision to engage diaspora. The diaspora, as I said, is not to be neglected. Our government, any government, has an obligation to look after its diaspora. For since independence, diaspora relations and remigration were supported by the administration and by political parties. When I go to London, when I go to Toronto, when I go to Nassau, when I go to St. George's, Grenada, I always ask to meet the diaspora, and I always voluntarily, happily meet the diaspora, and it's an experience because these people in the diaspora, and some of you might very well be looking at me from in the diaspora. These are not strangers. These are people who love their homeland. There's nostalgia, deep nostalgia for Guyana, and you just offer them some black pudding. You just offer them some Korean roti. You just offer them some mitai or some tamarind balls, and you see the eyes light up when they think of the things that they enjoyed as children. So we have never ignored diaspora relations and remigration. And a diaspora unit was created. There's one now in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the role is to liaise between the government of Guyana and the diaspora, particularly the persons who come out as the leaders. And of course, there's too many non-governmental organizations. We're not trying to pick and choose who should lead. There's no one diaspora. There's several countries and there's several associations, and they all can speak for themselves. But the diaspora unit is meant to establish some liaison between the central government and the diaspora to collect information and to maintain relations with the executives or the leaders, whoever is set up to represent the people, the Guyanese people, or the people identifying themselves as Guyanese. And as a result of that, our government engaged the IOM, the International Organization of Migration, and we established a sort of plan, or we drafted a plan called the Diaspora Engagement Strategy and Action Plan, DSAP. And that was drafted in 2017. But as you know, in Guyana, when the government changes, the plan was thrown out of the window, and before it could be implemented. And it was a good plan to engage the communities, to engage home countries, and to make greater use of the social media. But it was due to be implemented in full in October 2020, and you know what happened then. The new government simply threw it out the window, and they continue to work in their way without accepting or adopting what was done before. That is their choice. But the Department of, or the Diaspora Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs continues to collaborate with the diaspora. And of course, it is a source of donations, it's a source of participation in conferences and other forms of engagement, particularly now during the pandemic. There is need for what I would call technology transfer, maybe even financial transfer, between the diaspora and Guyana to help us through this pandemic. It's not over yet, and we rely on the support of the diaspora, and we have been getting that support. But donations can go only so far, and we need to look at what has happened. And of course, we've had huge donations from the diaspora in Canada, and in keeping with their abilities and the assets which they have at their disposal. So we see that there's been a merger of the diaspora and migration units, and let us live with that. That is what we have. The diaspora, my friends, is not a sideshow. It is an important part of Guyana. Some people reckon that Guyana, half of Guyana lives in North America, half lives in South America. Well, that is probably true. There probably are as many Guyanese or persons of Guyanese birth or persons who are descended from Guyanese living abroad as living in Guyana. I suppose if you want to put it like that, the Guyanese population, taken as a whole, is about 1.5 million. We can live with that. But in the post-independence period, the remittances from the diaspora have surged, and the World Bank estimates up to the year before the last that the remittances are valued at about $393 million flowing into Guyana. 5.3% of our GDP comes from remittances. I can tell you this, when I go to the supermarket, there's always a huge queue, not to buy goods, but for money transfers. And that is a thriving business. But it means that remittances, it's not just charity. Guyana is still a poor country, and many poor families depend on remittances from their relatives in the diaspora for everyday living expenses. We hope that we'll pull out of this economic downturn after the pandemic, but you know what is happening all around the world. The diaspora continues to contribute to education, training, social services. You remember the era of barrels? Well, we've passed the barrel stage now and we've gone into money transfers. But there has been a lot of collaboration between the central government of Guyana and the International Organization of Migration. And there are a lot of pilot projects hoping to attract Guyanese or members of the diaspora back to Guyana to look at opportunities for employment, for enterprise, and of course, to make a profit. So this is a process that cannot be discontinued. We are interested in businessmen, but we mustn't feel that only businessmen live in the diaspora. Those of you who are in the diaspora know very well that there are various strata in the diaspora. For example, I have gone to Nassau in the Bahamas, as I said before, to Bridgetown in Barbados, to St. George's, Grenada. I've also gone to Toronto and London and New York and Washington and Florida. I haven't traveled much for the last 4 years for reasons which you know very well. But we are not only concerned with scientists and rich people, engineers. We're not only concerned with dames and knights. We're concerned with ordinary Guyanese who still love their country and who want to be represented. I don't believe that any Guyanese should ever be stateless. We have an obligation to set up consulates in all of the countries where we have huge groups, whether they're homeborn or not. There are many Guyanese descendants who would like to come to their parents' homeland and tidy up business like NIS or property or other legal business. So we need consulates in all of these countries. And if you look at the diaspora in countries like Antigua, and I once spoke to the Prime Minister of Antigua, and he admitted that the Antiguan-born population is just about 50%. that most of the people in Antigua, or at least half of the people, were foreign born, mainly from Guyana and Jamaica. So it is something that he lives with. He doesn't try to fight it. He doesn't try to keep people out. There's no Guyana bench in Antigua. Guyanese come and go. In the Bahamas, I recall going to secondary school in the Bahamas before the last hurricane, and there were 21 Guyanese university graduates teaching at a Bahamian secondary school. And one of the teachers put on the Guyana flag, and all of them came out, all 21 of them came out singing the Guyana national anthem. I shared their pride, naturally. Uh, and then Barbados, I remember going to Barbados asking to meet the diaspora, and I think the place selected was too small. I remember driving past that the venue. It was a restaurant of some sort. I asked the driver, I said, "What's going on there?" Is it a crusade? Is it a Sunday morning? Is it a crusade? They're waiting for you. And that is a picture of them there, Guyanese in Barbados, waiting to see their president. And in Brazil and Canada and Guyana, unfortunately, many of the Guyanese who go to Guyana, what we call KN, um, remain as guests of the French government. Some of them commit offenses and have to be imprisoned. But many of them go and get involved in ordinary work and perform legitimate functions within the state. And of course, in Suriname, there's a large diaspora there, and Venezuela and Brazil. So many homeborn groups maintain contact, and we also have large diasporas in the Netherlands, in the UK, and USA. Many of them are highly qualified, but in the Eastern Caribbean, many of them are ordinary workers, and they never become celebrities. And we must treat all of them with respect and recognize their contributions to the countries that they have adopted. And although they may never come back, they shared a deep nostalgia for the country of their birth, the Guyanese homeland. The United States Immigration Naturalization Service (INS) reported that, some years ago, the data might be dated. There were over 200,000 regularized Guyanese immigrants in that country alone. And of course, Guyanese, they might also be irregular immigrants, persons who are not there in keeping with the laws of the United States. The situation is that the diaspora is here to stay. It is not a flash in the pan. It is not something that is going to disappear. It is not something that any political party could ignore or any government could ignore. And we need to have a structured policy in handling the diaspora. It's not one diaspora. It's not one size fits all. This diaspora has been drawn from different levels of society, and they have different aspirations. Some of them have been pushed there by, factors in Guyana. Some have been attracted to the better life. Some have made a good living there and have come back home to settle. I'm not here to prescribe. I'm here simply to recognize the fact that diaspora is a reality. And we call on the Ministry of Home Affairs, particularly, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Home Affairs and Legal Affairs. All three ministries must work to make sure that no Guyanese are left out. Now that we talk about registration, now that we talk about migration, now that we talk about the facility of coming and going without interference by the governments of the countries where they're living. But there is a constitutional duty. It is written in the Constitution of Guyana that we have an obligation to protect the rights and interests of persons living abroad. So it is not a sort of option that we have. The government has an obligation under the Constitution to protect the rights and interests of citizens. I'm quoting from the Constitution here. the rights and interests of citizens living abroad. So what we want to see is a proliferation of consulates, so that honorary consulates as well, so wherever Guyanese find themselves, they could walk in and say, I am a Guyanese, and I would like assistance in renewing my passport. I'd like to find some information about my NIS payments or my pension benefits. I'd like to make contact with relatives. And let us set up a proper, regular documentation system based on the modern communications media, so that people can transact business with a move of a mouse or some other device, without having to travel and wait 3 or 4 days, for copies of documents and transports. Let us try to facilitate the needs of our huge diaspora. We talk about two populations, one living in the Cooperative Republic of Guyana and one living overseas. And just as we look after the interests in terms of citizenship and registration for people living in Guyana, we must also look after the interests of those Guyanese who are not living in Guyana. And this is what I ask. And those persons who are in the diaspora, raise your voices and continue not only to love Guyana, but continue to articulate the needs of the government and those particular ministries, foreign affairs, home affairs, and legal affairs, to ensure that your rights are protected and that you can be as happy in the country of your birth as the country that you have adopted. The diaspora is important to all of us. Guyana is important to the diaspora, and the diaspora is important to Guyana. This is the message I leave with you today, and may God bless you all. Thank you. Goodbye.
Each man must do his